in listen-only mode.
Good morning. My name is Cameron McElhenney, and I am the Director of Training and Education for the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. I would like to thank all of you for attending today's webinar on predictive policing. Before we start, I would like to provide you with some information that should enhance your experience with us today. First, if you have not done so already, please maximize your browsers. This will allow you to better view the presentation and the animations included within. Secondly, following today's presentation, Dr. Branningham will have time to answer some of your questions. If you do wish to submit a question, please type it into the box provided on your control panel. We will try and get to as many of them as possible. Lastly, today's webinar is being recorded. A copy of the recording will be available on the NACOL website, www.nacol.org, in the next 24 hours. With the housekeeping out of the way, I would like to move on to why you have all joined us today. I am pleased to welcome our presenter, Dr. Jeffrey Branningham, a professor of anthropology at the University of California, Los Angeles. Jeff directs the UC Mathematical and Simulation Modeling of Crime Project, a collaboration between mathematicians, social scientists, and law enforcement agencies aimed at understanding criminal behavior and crime hotspot information. The goal of this research is to seek evidence-based, model-driven crime prevention and policing strategies. Jeff has published more than 50 academic journal articles, and his work on the mathematics of crime and predictive policing has received widespread media coverage, including features by the Associated Press, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and BBC, NBC, and CBS News. He is co-founder of Predpol, a company dedicated to delivering real-time crime predictions to law enforcement agencies both nationally and internationally. With this, I introduce you to Dr. Jeff Branningham.
Well, thank you very much, Cameron. Just to confirm that everybody can hear me and see my my presentation. I would like to start off by just saying it's a real honor to be able to speak to all of you here. While that introduction leads you to believe that this is largely an academic exercise, really what this is about putting the right type of technology and data into the hands of police officers to help them do their job better. And the truth is that policing with data is much better than policing without data. The real challenge is to know how to use those data in the most appropriate and effective means. There are lots of different ways in which data can be used, but not all of that is actually going to benefit policing on the ground. I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes here, and I know the webinar format can sometimes be awkward, but I'm going to speak for 30 minutes and then leave the remaining time available for questions. I know that it's unlikely that we'll be able to get to every question that you might have, so I've put up on this title slide here email direct contact for me, or you can email info@predpol.com, and I'd be happy to answer any more of your questions about what's going on with Predpol and predictive policing more generally. Now, the important thing to recognize about predictive policing and Predpol in particular is really where it came from. And I think if you understand the problem at hand that we started to approach as researchers, you'll understand why Predpol is actually a benefit to police officers in the field. And this slide that you're seeing here captures the fundamental problem in a nutshell. At the end of the day, policing crime patterns is really, really hard. This is something we have a lot of data about, but how to use that information in an effective way is a very challenging problem. What you see here in this slide shows the two sort of contrasting challenges. On the left-hand side of the slide, you have essentially a long-term hotspot map. This is looking at a year's worth of violent crime data in a sector of Los Angeles where there happen to be a large number of gangs packed into that area. And when a police officer looks at a map like this, they sort of have a a good strategic view of how to use that information. The area covered by the hotspot map is about 15 square miles, and that big bright red hotspot is around 3.5 miles in area, square miles in area, and there are a bunch of gangs packed into that area. When a police officer looks at that, they say, I know what to do with this information. That's the place where I can put my resources. And by resources, I mean anything that the police department might have access to, everything from patrol to city partners, what have you, the resources that are necessary to solve the problems that are at hand there. And that type of hotspot policing is actually really effective. We've known that for going on a couple of decades now. But the truth is that on a day-to-day basis, crime patterns don't really look anything like what you see on the left-hand side there. They look like what you see on the right-hand side, which is a picture of violent crime in Chicago over the course of 2011 to 2013. And the image that appears here is one of hotspots not being stationary. They pop up, they spread, they disappear, and they pop up in seemingly random pattern. And if you are a supervisor or a patrol officer who has to deal with crime today on a day-to-day basis, it's not immediately clear how you should be using data to get out in front of those crime patterns, to stop those hotspots before they start. And that, at the end of the day, is what PredPol is providing a solution for. And predictive policing, the way we do it, is really aimed at getting out in front of those crime patterns. What I'm going to do over the next a few minutes here is really dive into a few things. The first thing that we need to get out of the way is actually defining predictive policing, because it is a term that rolls off the tongue easily, but there's a lot of confusion about what we mean by predictive policing. Hopefully I'll provide a way that lays that out so that you can really understand what the space of predictive policing looks like and ultimately what it is that PredPol is doing. Then we're going to dive into the details and ask the question, well, what is it that PredPol is actually doing? Is this just a black box, or is it something that's really transparent and contributes to transparent data-driven policing? Then I'm going to talk about how is it that our police department partners have used PredPol, what does it do for their day-to-day practice, and then ultimately I'll turn to test cases coming out of the Los Angeles Police Department that shows how it actually works. Does it actually work in the field? And I'm a strong believer in the idea that we should be doing rigorous experimental testing of all sorts of technologies that we put in our law enforcement partners' hands. If it doesn't work better than what they're already doing, then you shouldn't be doing it. And hopefully I'll show you some evidence that points in the direction of why this is such a benefit to police officers. Following that, I'll take as many questions as we can fit in the available time. Okay, so predictive policing is a term that comes with a lot of baggage, if you will. To sort of dilute that down to really what's going on, we can ask sort of two questions, right? We can break down the problem into essentially, what are you trying to predict, and then what data are you using to try and predict that phenomena? In terms of what you're trying to predict, there are really two things that we can think about. You can try to predict who is going to commit a crime, or you can try and predict where and when crime is most likely to occur. Two very different things. Are you focusing on who, the person that is going to commit a crime, or are you going to focus on where and when crime is most likely to occur, regardless of who the potential offender is? In terms of the data, you can break it down into two different domains as well. You can talk about what I think of as risk factors. These are aspects or characteristics of people and environments that are themselves not criminal in nature. A good example might be socioeconomic status or racial ethnic characteristics, or in terms of environments, things like the percentage of abandoned buildings or street network structure. None of those things are in and of themselves criminal in nature, yet there's lots of criminological research to imply or suggest that they tell us something about crime. So there are risk factors, or you can use what we might call event histories. These are actual verified crimes that have occurred in the past that can be attributed to certain individuals, or they can be attributed to certain places and certain times. Now, that's a really nice way of dividing up the problem, and if we think about those as creating sort of two dimensions of what we need to focus on, it creates a great classification of what we might mean by predictive policing. So if we think about using risk factors to predict who will commit a crime, this upper left quadrant of the slide here, this is essentially the domain of criminal profiling. You're using non-criminal characteristics of individuals to predict who will commit a crime. We know that this has tremendous problems at multiple levels, and that continue to be something that we should be really concerned about. If we're using risk factors to predict where and when crime is most likely to occur, this is the domain of risk terrain modeling, where you're using things like the distribution of housing density, broad-scale population demographic characteristics, street network structures, percentage of abandoned buildings or bars or churches or whatever it happens to be, to assess the risk of a location for where and when crime is most likely to occur. If we move over to the right-hand column of how to go about predictive policing, you can use event histories, past verified crimes, to predict who is going to commit a crime. This is what I would call broadly as the domain of intelligence-led policing, using, or intelligence-led forecasting, using the past event histories attributed to certain individuals to predict the likelihood that they will commit a crime in the future. This sort of thing is often being used in parole decision-making, for example. And then finally, down in the lower right-hand corner here, you have the space in which Predpol is operating. This is using past criminal events in space and in time, verified crimes that are in police databases, to predict where and when crime is most likely to occur. This is a very unique and a very special domain in which to be doing predictive policing that comes with a lot of advantages from the point of view of understanding what drives crime, but also in avoiding a lot of the challenges that might arise with focusing on people as the subject of prediction. So what is it exactly that Predpol does? Let's look at the science in great detail. Predpol is really based on two things, right? It uses only verified crime records. And what do I mean by that? It only looks at crimes that have made their way out of calls for service data into recorded police databases. And this, from those data, the only things we look at are what type of crime is it, where did it occur, and when did it occur. Note I didn't say anything about who are the suspects, has it been cleared, what do the suspects look like, any of those sorts of individual characteristics that might go along with who the perpetrators of those crimes might be. And notice I also didn't say anything about environmental characteristics. What were the weather patterns? What were the street network structure? What were the distributions of different land use characteristics? The only data that's going into this, into Predpol, is what type of crime is it, where did it occur, and when did it occur? And that has two types of advantages. One major advantage is that you can use those data in almost real time. If you think about it, for virtually every event that lands in a police database, right, in their records management system, they know what, where, and when. A lot of that other stuff they might not know. They might not who was there, or why they were there, or what the motives were associated with the crime. What do they look like? Any of that other stuff might not be available. And in a lot of cases, the broader environmental and social data that would be available might be out of date. It might not be incredibly accurate. What we know is what, where, and when is almost universally available for crime, and it's something that police have become very adept at collecting. That information tends to have far fewer problems in terms of the accuracy and the precision of the data relative to a lot of other data that might land in police databases. This means you can use these data in near real time. As fast as it comes out of the field, it lands in the police databases, and it's available to drive predictions that are relevant to what's happening on the street today. The other thing that's important here to note is that what, where, and when in and of itself is not criminal profiling. It's focused on the events that come to the attention of the police, and as many of you know, somewhere upwards of 80 to 90% of the events that are known to police are reported by the public. These are the crimes that the public wants the police to know about. And I would argue that in using those data, the what, the where, and the when, police are actually being responsive to the demands of the public that they're serving. Right? It's not about focusing on the individuals, it's focusing on where and when the crime is most likely to occur. So what do we do with it? Well, yes, this is a project that arose out of mathematical research based at UCLA, where I'm a professor. And the math is incredibly complicated math. There's no doubts about it. But the math that's going on behind your iPhone or your Samsung or your BlackBerry is also incredibly complicated, yet it gets the job done. So I put the math up there not so much to dazzle you with what's going on in the background, but to say, actually, we can go one step further and tell you not only is there complicated math, but you, as representatives of civilian oversight of police or the police officers themselves, can actually understand how and why this is doing what it's doing. There are really three things that go into a crime event and the emergence of crime hotspots. Number one is environments. There are places out there in any given environment that are what we would call crime generators. They're just built-in features of the environment that generate crime. A good example of this is something like a high school. A high school has a standing crop of young men, and what do we know about young men between the ages of 14 and 17 or 14 and 18? They get into trouble, and they will get into trouble every year, and that high school is not going anywhere. It creates an anchor point for the activity of those individuals. And as a result, if you're trying to predict where and when crime is most likely to occur, you have to take that sort of crime generator into consideration. You have to figure out what is the impact of those sorts of locations on where crime is going to occur. And every environment is composed of lots of different crime generators, big and small. On top of those built-in features of the environment, there's short-term stuff that goes on. A classic one being repeat victimization. We know from looking at dozens of cities around the world that if your house is broken into today, the chance that it's broken into tomorrow is actually higher. Lightning does strike twice in the case of crime, and if you go and ask offenders about this, they'll tell you, yeah, I like to go back to places where I was successful before. Why should I go down around the corner to some other location where I don't know what the risks are when I can go back to the house I was at 2 days ago and be just as successful as I was that time and take away the things I didn't take away the first time around. That's repeat victimization. Near repeat victimization essentially says that if your house is broken into, your neighbor's house is actually a greater risk because your neighbor's house actually looks pretty much exactly like your house. And what the offender was successful in accomplishing at your house can be easily mapped to the next door neighbors, to your neighbor's house. As a result, risk spreads in little local pockets. And what ties these together is local search. Most offenders like to work locally to where they feel comfortable. That's often near where they live, near where they work, near the bar that they hang out or the school that they go to, and there are usually a handful of those locations. These are things that we know empirically drive crime patterns, and that's all that's being captured over on the right-hand side by the math. The math allows us to say something very concrete, very formal, very rigorous about how each of those behavioral components contribute to the evolving of crime hotspots. And what the math does is it generates hotspots like you see over on the left-hand side here. It essentially an accurate picture of the distribution of risk today in the next 10 hours or the next 12 hours. And the truth is that that's a really great scientific outcome, and a bunch of publications came out of my research group on exactly that work. So as a scientific achievement, that's great. But I would say that from the point of view of practical value to police forces, that doesn't go far enough. And the truth is that if we handed out a hotspot map like you see on the left-hand side there, that's a very large area. It's all of the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. If we handed out a map like that at roll call for police forces day in, day out, the first couple of days police might be dazzled by how pretty the map is. But the truth is that a hotspot map like that is not easy to use. Which of those hotspots do I go to if I have a limited amount of time? Police officers do not have infinite amount of time. They have to make critical decisions about where do they go, what do they do, and particularly with that really valuable discretionary time. What do they do in that time? Which of those hotspots do they go to? Some of those hotspots are entire neighborhoods. Where do they go in that neighborhood? Those are tough decisions that create friction in the use of data in the field. And what we've done at PredPol is actually boil that down to the simplest tactical recommendation that can be made. And on the right-hand side, you see this in the way that a police officer would see it. Here's a red box. The risk of crime inside that red box is higher than anywhere else out on the landscape today in the next 10 hours, the next 12 hours. From the point of view of the police officer on the street or the watch commander in the station, if they can put themselves inside that box, they have a greater chance of disrupting crime than being anywhere else out on the landscape. That's the simplest tactical recommendation that they can have, and they can use it very easily. Where's the box? Can I put myself in the box for 2 or 3 minutes and have a better chance of disrupting crime than being anywhere else out on the street? And there are a couple of things to recognize about these boxes, though, right? That seems like a simple tactical recommendation. There are two important things to recognize about what Predpol is doing. First of all, those boxes are not entire neighborhoods. They are small, tiny areas that represent, a block or a half a block in size, depending upon the city. They're 500 by 500 foot square foot areas. That is a really small scale to be working at, but it's the scale we need to be working at if we want to disrupt crime. Think about it from this point of view, right? You might have a neighborhood in a city that has a lot of burglary over the course of the year. You actually don't need predictive policing to know that. You already know that as a result of your experience on the street, the hotspot maps you might generate. But today, in the next 10 hours, not every house in that neighborhood is at risk. It's really 2 or 3 houses that are at greatest risk. You need to operate at the scale of those 2 to 3 houses to be able to disrupt that crime today. Right? Yes, you need to engage that community over the course of the whole year. You need to come up with a strategic plan that has the community engaged in that problem. But from the point of view of the patrol officer today, they need to operate down at the scale of the 2 or 3 houses that are at greatest risk. And that's what this micro-scale 500 by 500 foot prediction produces for police officers on the street. It's also the case that those predictions are not static. Unlike hotspot mapping, where a police force might develop a map and use it over the course of weeks or maybe even a whole deployment period, Predpol predictions are changing on a shift-by-shift basis as crime patterns are evolving. Remember, crime is not static. It's bouncing around. It's jumping from one place to another. In order to get out in front of crime, predictions need to be as dynamic as that. What you see on the right-hand side is an animation of 6 months worth of predictions in an area of Los Angeles, where you can see how the boxes move around on a shift-by-shift basis and build up concentrations of attention over the course of the medium term. And that adaptability gives officers the flexibility to be out in front of the crime problem in a way that might not be otherwise at their disposal. A critical thing here is that we offer information about where and when crime is most likely to occur, but we say nothing about how police officers should be using that information. It's really up to the police forces themselves to set priorities about what strategies and tactics are most important. Police officers in communication with their civilian oversight boards. What are the ways in which we want to tackle crime? Predpol does not get in the way of that. It is saying, here's a location where the risk of crime is greatest. Use your skills, your knowledge, your experience, your training, your priorities to get into those locations and disrupt crime in the way that makes the most sense for your community. So you can do community policing at the micro scale. Who better than to interact with than the people who are most likely to be victims today, in the next 10 hours or the next 12 hours? Or if you want to work with the city to do problem-oriented crime prevention through environmental design, then here are the locations where that sort of approach is most likely to have an impact. If you're going to do high visibility policing, here are locations where it is most likely to have an impact today, in the next 10 hours, the next 12 hours. It doesn't matter what the strategy is. You're the ones who have the skills and experience to choose what those are. Predpol is helping put those strategies into play in the right places at the right times. It does not replace the knowledge, skills, and experience of the police forces themselves. Okay, the final piece of the puzzle is a really important one, and that is, does it actually work? The truth is if it doesn't actually predict more crime, if it doesn't create opportunities for police officers, and at the end of the day it doesn't reduce crime, then we need to go back to the drawing board and look at how do we actually do those things. If it doesn't work better than what's already happening, what's already being used by police forces, then don't use it. We've looked at this in a number of different ways. We've done essentially randomized controlled drug trials, which I'll talk about here in a second, with the Los Angeles Police Department, and as you see on the screen here, in Kent, England. We've also done matched area trials, like the work we did with the Atlanta Police Foundation in Atlanta, and then there are also a number of natural experiments that have emerged out of work in a variety of places, but I'll talk about some work here in 2 divisions of Los Angeles. So randomized controlled trials are critical to understand, does something work better than existing practice? And the way we've actually gone about this is to put predictions out in the field, have them used by officers where they don't know whether they're using the placebo or the control versus using predictions driven by Predpol or the treatment. And that allows you to say, does it actually work better than existing practice, in the same way that you can say this pharmaceutical works better than the existing pharmaceutical that's out there, without all of those added placebo effects that you might expect from patients if they knew that they were taking the new drug. In Los Angeles, we did a series of experiments that ran over the course of 21 months. I'm showing you here results from Foothill Division, Southwest Division, and North Hollywood. We also ran 8 months worth of experiments on predictive accuracy in Kent, England. You see those for 2 divisions over on the left-hand side. The punchline here is that when you look at how much predictive accuracy Predpol delivers, that is, how many crimes are actually being predicted on a day-to-day basis, Predpol is predicting somewhere around twice as much crime as is available from existing best practice. In Los Angeles, this is sort of a version of hotspot policing with some mixture of street-level day-to-day intelligence thrown in. In Kent, England, they follow the national intelligence model, so very intelligence-driven policing, and there you see anywhere from 1.4 to 1.7 times as much crime being predicted. This is telling us in very rigorous, controlled fashion that twice as much crime is being predicted in those little red boxes on a day-to-day, shift-by-shift basis. The implication is that this creates an opportunity to disrupt twice as much crime. And that's exactly what we saw in the case of the Los Angeles Police Department. Under those randomized controlled experiments where the officers didn't know whether they were policing using LAPD hotspotting or Predpol, under average amounts of what we would call dosage or officer effort in those locations, when Predpol boxes were used in the field, LAPD was preventing twice as much crime as when they were using hotspot predictions in the field. Twice as much crime was being prevented, in addition to twice as much crime being predicted. This is saying that when officers use this on a day-to-day basis, they can actually have a huge bump in the amount of crime reduction that they're seeing in the field, and that creates opportunities to engage in other critical activities in the environment. Now, one important thing I'll mention about this is that this result was achieved on 5% of available time. What does that mean? It's one patrol officer spending anywhere from 25 to 30 minutes over the course of their 12-hour shift going in and out of boxes. Predpol is not about saying, spend all of your time in the box. Do only your policing in the box. No, it's about saying, spend 2 minutes here, 5 minutes there, 7 minutes there. If you can get 30 minutes over the course of a 12-hour shift in these various boxes around the landscape, you can have a huge impact. This is not about replacing existing strategies and tactics. It's about saying, here's information that can be used as part of existing strategies and tactics, seamlessly integrating with what your police force is doing in a way to have a big impact. We've seen this also in natural experiments, and this is the final sort of scientific piece that I'll conclude on, and that is, it's not an all or nothing proposition. What you're looking at in this slide along the bottom axis is number of hours per week spent in prediction boxes versus crimes per week in 2 different divisions of the Los Angeles Police Department over the first sort of 20 weeks or so of 2014. And what you'll note is, as the amount of dosage increases, as you move from left to right on the x-axis, the amount of crime goes down in that division per week, anywhere as much as 30 to 40% on high dosage weeks. On low dosage weeks, where lots of other things were going on and police officers didn't have the amount of time that they could dedicate to Predpol missions, crime reduction was not as great. But note that a little bit of dosage gets you a big bang for your buck. Increasing it beyond some sort of limit gives you marginal returns. The way to think about the relationship between police effort and the use of Predpol in the field is a lot like the way you think about unemployment, right? It's really a lot easier to go from 10% unemployment to 8% than to go from 8 to 9. And going from 9 to 7 gets even harder. And as you get farther and farther towards the basement, it gets even harder and harder and harder to reduce crime. And the same thing goes for something like predictive policing, right? A little bit of time in prediction boxes gives you a big bang for your buck, but you do not need to spend 500 or 1,000 hours of your precious available time in prediction boxes to have a huge impact. You can spend 50, 60, 70 hours over the course of a whole week across all of your deployment units to have a big impact. And that's really encouraging. It's not an all or nothing proposition. So the final things I want to mention, and this is very important for the audience here, is that leadership matters. Data-driven policing is very important. It's a critical part, I would argue, for the future of policing. But the data itself doesn't do the policing. No database is going to go out on the street and do what needs to be done. It's the organization, it's the oversight, it's how officers are managed and directed and led out onto the street that really matters. If they have the right data and the right organization and the right training and the right skills in the field, that is a powerful brew, if you will, of how to deal with crime. Leadership really matters. The data is not going to do the policing in and of itself. This also turns the arrest model on its head. While it is the case that sometimes officers are going to be in the right place at the right time to make that critical arrest, to stop a crime in progress, as any law enforcement officer knows on the street, those opportunities to catch a crime in progress are really rare over the course of an entire career. And that's not any different with PredPol. Most of the opportunities that are created here are to get into these locations, to create disruptions, right, to make it harder for the offender to commit the crime, to remove their low-hanging fruit, to engage the community and to talk to them, to elicit their response and their support in doing something about the crime problem in that location. It's not about increasing arrests. It's about decreasing arrests, to decrease victimization through just making it harder for offenders to do what they want to do in those locations. And then it also creates great opportunities for police officers. These boxes are in the highest risk locations, and because we are not telling police officers anything about how to do their job, we're not telling them what they should be doing in those locations, we often see them using them in creative ways at their own initiative. And what you're seeing in this slide is something that came out of a sergeant within the Los Angeles Police Department's initiative. It was entrepreneurial thinking on their part. This sergeant went into his commanding officer and said, you know what, boss, today I want to bring out our cadets and our units and spend an hour inside one of these prediction boxes, knock on all of the doors in this high-density housing unit, and bring everybody out into the parking lot and have an impromptu community meeting. Engage them in community policing for an hour and then move on to the other problems we have to deal with. Doing community policing on a day-to-day basis, on a spontaneous basis, and this is just one of the sort of initiatives that have come out of the police officers themselves, as opposed to being some sort of a directive that comes out of predictive policing itself. So with that, let me just reemphasize what PredPol is and what it is not. This is not a replacement for the knowledge, skills, and experience of police officers. It's not profiling of individuals. We do not use anything about who are the offenders, what do they look like, what are their motives. But at the same time, this does not replace the requirement of constitutional policing. Probable cause is not part and process of why a box is on the landscape. Officers know and they need to follow procedures on what is it that makes a reasonable suspicion, what is it that makes probable cause, and use all of those skills and experiences in the ways that they know to be most appropriate. So what is it at the end of the day? It is just accurate predictions for where and when crime is most likely to occur. It's easy for police officers at all levels of the organization to use and gives them an effective means of reducing crime and engaging the community. So with that, I'm happy to take any and all questions that we can get to in the time that's remaining here. So thank you for your attention, and let's take some questions. Let's see, where is my question screen? Here we go. So let's see, I'll read out these questions here, although you can see them. Hello, I'm curious of the size of the city by population effects on the accuracy. Actually, this is a fantastic question. PredPol has been deployed in cities of all sizes and cities with tremendous diversity and mixture of land use types. Everything from, really small communities like Norcross, Georgia, that have around 10 to 15,000 people, anywhere up through megacities like Los Angeles, where you're dealing with populations in the millions. And remember, the one thing that's going on here is that the mathematics that we use draw on and adapt to the crime problem of the local area. right? So it's not about using big city math and big city data to and just mapping that onto a small city area. No, it looks at the data and the crime that's coming out of that local jurisdiction, and it adapts to that problem in the same way, by analogy, that Netflix adapts to your movie watching behavior to make recommendations. It doesn't use some other random person's to you about what movies to watch. No, it looks at your behavior. What movies do you watch? And then it makes appropriate recommendations on the basis of that. And we've seen that predictive accuracy is maintained in small areas, large areas, in areas with mixtures of rural and urban sorts of environments. And in fact, prediction accuracy goes up in rural areas, which was a surprise to us initially, but actually makes quite a bit of sense when you think about the distribution of targets. Let's see. Can you address crime data accuracy and the impact of diminished accuracy? Let's see if I can see the whole question here. I can't quite see the whole question. Diminished accuracy. So one of the things that we found in a place like Los Angeles is that we anticipated when we first started that over time, accuracy would actually diminish as police extracted more value out of it. So you can imagine if you push the crime problem lower, you're essentially removing any signal out of what you're sort of attaching onto from the purposes of prediction. And much to our surprise, that's proven not to be the case. It turns out that when you look at a division like Foothill Division, the Los Angeles Police Department, that they're getting about the same predictive accuracy on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis today, 3.5 years into deployment as they were at the very beginning. Why is that? Well, it's because the predictions are constantly evolving and adapting as the crime pattern is changing. As crime is reducing, the predictions adapt to how those crime patterns are changing and continue to deliver predictive accuracy. It's evolving with the nature of the crime problem, and that's very encouraging. It means that this is not something that you need to put in place for 6 months and then forget about it. No, it's something that continues to deliver predictive accuracy even years into the process itself. Caught us by surprise as researchers, but it's much like the predictive accuracy of movies that you might want to watch change as you switch from one genre of movie to another. It still is able to adapt to how your taste might be changing. Let's see. Are you aware of any jurisdictions using PredPol labels areas as high crime, such as that used when to justify or challenge reasonable suspicion, stops, frisks, or searches? No, I'm not aware of that. In all of our deployments, PredPol is something that's used force-wide, and it adapts to the crime problems as they're seen. And so when you look at things in terms of, let's say, an entire division or in terms of an entire jurisdiction, it's reflecting the types of crimes that are being reported into the system, and then those predictions are being used back at primarily at a patrol level for officers to make decisions on the street about where can they spend their 2 or 3 minutes to engage the problem as they see fit. Does the usefulness of the data vary with the types of crimes? Is it easier to predict break-ins versus homicides? Interestingly enough, yes, there is some variability across crime types in predictive accuracy, but it's not always what you would expect. It turns out that some types of crimes, you might expect, say, for example, burglary to be universally more predictable than other crimes, but what we've seen in places like deployments in the UK or in Orange County, Florida, for example, that robbery actually tends to jump out as the crime with the highest degree of predictive accuracy. In other settings, it tends to be burglary, theft from motor vehicle that has the highest degree of predictive accuracy. And the truth is that the math is adapting to each unique crime problem. And that sort of feedback is something that we give to the forces themselves, and they can look at it themselves and say, right, we're getting the highest degree of predictive accuracy on these types of crimes. Those are the ones that we want to be using PredPol to focus. So it's not universally the case that some crimes are more predictable than others, and it turns out that some crimes, like let's say gun-related violence, are still predictable. though we tend to approach gun-related violence in a slightly different way in the background mathematically, but using a range of crime types to predict, say, gun-related homicide, but you can still achieve a high degree of predictive accuracy for gun-related homicides, much like what you would see for burglary. So how are the number of boxes determined for each area? You know what? There's no magic number. The truth is that the more boxes that you add, the more predictive accuracy that you get. So I can tell you how to predict 100% of crime in, choose your jurisdiction, Chicago PD. The way to predict 100% of crime is to put a prediction on every single spot within the whole jurisdiction. Then there will be a crime that occurs in certainly the crimes that occur will necessarily occur in a box. We've predicted 100% of crime. But that's not realistic because you can't visit all of those boxes. You have to choose some small subset of boxes to be out on the landscape, and it's usually anywhere from about less than 0.5% of land area up to a maximum of about 1% of land area. And if you look at a place like Foothill Division in Los Angeles, they were predicting 6% of crime in less than 0.5% of land area. So a huge boost in the amount of crime that's being predicted for the tiny amount of crime that was a tiny number of predictions that are on the landscape. But there's no cutoff. The more boxes you add, the more crime you're going to predict. The number of boxes you choose is dependent upon the resources that you have available. You want to scale the number of boxes that are out there such that it's appropriate to the type of resources that are out there on the street. And we have recommendations that we make to police forces about that. To arrive at something that's optimal for the resources that are available. It can be as few as just a handful, or it can be as many as a couple of dozen, depending upon the resources that are available. We sort of answered this question about what crimes does it provide best accuracies for. Mostly we focus on street-based crimes. So we don't tend to focus on things like domestic-related violence. These are mostly street-based crimes, but within those street-based crimes, you get good predictive accuracy, better than any other technique for that full spectrum of crimes. And we see a lot of forces focusing on the full spectrum of their Part 1 crimes and dealing with this. Yes, somebody mentioned that Topanga uses 20 boxes, and that adds up to, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere just under about a percent of total land area. Maybe Camille can clarify that. In addition to calls for service, is arrest data part of the or any other data part of the PredPol analysis? Absolutely not. Arrest data or other information about individuals and their characteristics do not make their way back into the predictions at all. This is driven solely by what type of crime is it, where did it occur, and when did it occur. And you might ask the question, well, how do you possibly do that with just that limited spectrum of data? And the way to think about this is that a lot of what you need to know, most of what you need to know is already incorporated into the crime data itself, right? So if I walk into a roll call at a police department and I say to the police officers there's a cluster of assaults that occur at 2:30 in the morning on this street corner, walk and don't walk. Do you actually need to go out and measure the bar that's on that street corner and measure the characteristics of the people who hang out at that bar to understand the crime pattern? It turns out that you don't need to. It's already built into the data. The data is telling you what you need to know about the risk of where and when crime is most likely to occur. That allows the officers to get out in front of this case. I'll ask you in terms of costs to departments or jurisdictions, I'll ask you to email us. We follow a model where we essentially price on the basis of population, but please email info@predpol.com to talk about that. But it's meant to be something that's feasible for police forces to make it part of their day-to-day routines. So are there particular factors that skew or throw off accuracy? We spend a lot of time focusing on the quality of the data. In general, the what, the where, and the when tends to be the types of data that have the least problems that are there. But nevertheless, there are problems with the time. sort of pinning down when the crime actually occurred. There might be a time window, or there might be issues with actually designating where the crime occurred, a geocoding problem, or maybe the address has a particular problem. And sometimes there are classification issues. We know that a number of crimes often get reclassified days or weeks into the event. We are constantly looking at the data from the point of view of those data quality issues and scrubbing those data to deal with those problems. And one thing to recognize about data for the use of prediction as opposed to data for the use of, say, investigative purposes is that sometimes it's better to throw out an event that might skew predictions, right, than to include it in the predictions. In the case of investigative work, you cannot tolerate throwing out of events. You've got to try and manage and deal with those data imperfections from the point of view of investigative thoroughness. From the point of view of prediction, if we know an event has problems, it's better to exclude that from the point of view of prediction than to include it for the potential skew or bias that it includes. But we're very attentive to the many sorts of problems that are readily apparent in these data, even though these types of data tend to have fewer problems than many. I'm aware of at least 2 transit police agencies that use a predictive model. Do we know how they geolocate such a wide area that crosses many jurisdictions? I'm not sure. It really depends on the nature of how they record their locations themselves and how they're actually using it. Yes, we talked about data skewing. Does it include drug crimes, possession, and sales? Typically, so any event that has a what, an where, and a when can potentially be accessible for predictions, but all of our deployments typically do not want to include drug crimes in their predictions. They're focused, for the most part, on their Part 1 crimes, and sometimes, occasionally, some Part 2 crimes like petty theft and things like that. But for the most part, most of our deployments are concentrated on Part 1 crimes, and that just reflects their priorities from the point of view of from the point of view of what their officers have to deal with on the street. Could this program be adapted to predict police misconduct? We're not really focused on predicting aspects of what individuals themselves are engaged in, what their activity patterns are per se. So this would represent a major digression from what it is that we're focusing on. So given that Predpol is very confident in being able to predict crime occurring in a given place or time, is it similarly confident that models predict individuals who are likely to commit crime? Again, we don't actually work on that, and in the case of any sort of analysis, there always has to be a balance between the positives that come out of a technology and the negatives. And one of the things that is really challenging with predicting who is going to commit a crime is the risk of false positives. Right? False positives, in my mind, are not acceptable when it comes to trying to predict who would commit a crime. And beyond that, the challenge of predicting who is going to commit a crime is much, much more problematic than in predicting where and when crime is most likely to occur. Frankly, as a criminologist, many of the ideas that go into what are the risk factors associated with individuals and commit crime have a lot of scientific gaps that need to be plugged before that could be realistic. And even if it were realistic, I'm not sure that it's a desirable outcome. And in any case, that's not what Predpol is focused on. We're focused on predicting where and when crime is most likely to occur so that actually the crime can be prevented. And prevention is beneficial to everybody. It produces fewer victims. It saves police officer time and engagement because now they're not writing a report that they would otherwise be writing, and they can engage the community in new ways. And it provides benefits to the potential offenders. Even though they might not see it this way, if you can prevent a crime, it produces one less opportunity wherein they could run afoul of the judicial system. And I see that as a problem. I see that as something that this helps benefit. So how does this exclude racist policies? Listen, we're focused on where and when crime is most likely to occur. This does not in any way replace or obviate careful design and oversight of policies. That is an essential part of modern policing. I see actually predictive policing as creating data that is transparent in where it comes from, how it's used, and transparent use of data, putting police into the right place at the right time, can only benefit that mission of engaging in constitutional policing. This does not replace in any way, shape, or form proper, appropriate, and effective management and oversight. So basically, you use crimes known to police. How does that differ when agencies report UCR and IBRS? Actually, we adapt to the coding system that the police departments themselves use. So the majority, I would say about 80 to 90% of our forces use UCR. Only a handful of them use NIBRS, but we adapt to both of those coding practices. We're sort of adjusted to dealing with that. Let's see, we collect location and time data for police misconduct, not who does it. Why can't it be assessed? In principle, it can be assessed because it is a what, a where, and a when. And while we're focused on supporting police departments and the missions and predicting what they want to predict, this is something that we can talk with you about. It hasn't been done by us, but it's something certainly worth looking at if that's something that you and your police forces are interested in doing. So reach out to us, and I'd be happy to talk about how you could map this to be effective in that way. Can this be used to predict the concentration of legal firearms? Absolutely. We've done a number of studies that actually look at how do you go about predicting gun homicide, and it turns out that, not surprising, well, maybe surprisingly, it's hard to say, the #1 predictor of gun homicides is where and when gun violations have been documented, right? So illegal possession of a firearm or a firearm recovered as part of some other crime. Illegal firearms or gun violations are the #1 predictor of where and when gun homicides are most likely to occur. So I see this as actually an event that's of tremendous importance. For a number of our deployments, we actually use a field which is, does the crime involve a gun? It's a flag for a gun-related crime. Orange County, Florida is an example of this. And that allows us to say a lot about the nature of those crimes. So yes, absolutely. The concentration of illegal firearms and illegal firearm violence is a key part of what we're doing. Yes, I believe, as was mentioned, the presentation will be made available through the NACOL website, and I'm happy to talk with anybody who wants more information and copy of the presentation, so reach out to me individually as well. If it's predicting where and when practices of police in certain areas, how is it accurate? The data is skewed, the results are skewed. Based on police, most murders are drug-related. If you're over-policing, not concentrating on drug busts, and we know that drug crime is, it's skewed. So there are a couple of things to recognize here. From the scientific point of view, we did all sorts of testing that involved assessing accuracy in the independent of police use. So you can think of this as putting predictions into the field, but police were not actually using the information. So you can get a reliable, independent assessment of how accurate are the predictions if the police are not actually using that information. So that's #1, and it's a critical part of the scientific process of assessing how it is that this information is used. Now, the other thing to recognize is that it might depend on force by force, but the vast majority of events that come to the attention of police and make their way into police databases are reported to them by the public. These are events that the public wants the police to know about. And there are plenty of events that are going on out there in the environment that the police do not know about for a variety of reasons. People don't report those crimes for all sorts of different reasons, many of which you're well aware of. The police can only operate off of those events that they actually know about. And I would argue that by using the data that we use in PredPol, you're actually being responsive to the demands that the public is placing on the police. It's not sort of a closed circle of the police discovering certain types of crimes and those making their way into the database, and that biases it towards those events. Certainly those types of events are present in the database, but they're far outweighed by the events that are actually being reported to the police by the public in general. Does PredPol require new input of information into the software, or can the data be extracted directly from CompStat? Directly from CompStat. This hooks up to the records management system of the police force, and most police forces, I'd hazard to say 99.9% of police forces around the U.S. are at a minimum have a database collecting information on what, where, and when, right? What, where, and when. A lot of that other stuff might not be collected. We hook up in real time to a mirror of that database, and the database then feeds that information into PredPol, and predictions are available right away. It doesn't require any new servers. It doesn't require any new other software. It runs off of whatever the existing data infrastructure is within that police force. So it's actually very low drag in terms of the actual IT and sort of personnel resources that go into deployment. So none of your data has stop and frisk, which based in New York was over 600K. So this is a great question. This helps distinguish between what PredPol is doing and what the tactics and strategies are on the street. We actually say nothing about how police forces are supposed to use this information. It is an accurate prediction about where and when crime is most likely to occur. How police forces use that information has to be conducted within the policy and procedures of the force and within a constitutional framework. We're strong believers in that. And your group plays a key role in ensuring that that's the process. All the different tactics of the diversity of tactics that police forces might use in the field, they have to use those within the framework that is constitutionally correct and appropriate in their case. There's nothing that steps in that way. Predictive policing PredPol merely allows them to use the forces that to use the tactics that are appropriate and sanctioned and approved in that impact crime in the places that are greatest risk of having crime today. And actually, I would argue that provides the best avenue for serving the public. Wow, that's a fantastic range of questions. I'm sure there are many other questions that you might have that you want to pass along. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me so that I can make sure you get the information that you need. I think that this format has worked actually reasonably well, and so I really appreciate that. We've maybe got time for one or two more questions if they pop in, and then I'll turn it back over to Cameron to close out the webinar. So in a small county like Trinidad with approximately 75 police stations, can PredPol be decentralized to each station for real-time viewing? Yes, there's a balance that has to be made between how finely you divide up predictions over an area and the impact that this has. And I'll leave you with an analogy that hopefully will stick with you. So think about it this way, right? I'm going to ask you, right, you've got your entire vinyl LP collection or your CD collection in front of you, and it covers a whole wall, right, if we were so lucky. I'm going to ask you, choose for me your top 20 albums of all time from your entire collection. And you go through and you choose all of your top 20 albums, and you present them to me. And that's really great. You've had your whole album collection to choose from. Now, what happens if I say you're only restricted to this 1 square foot area of your collection to choose your top 20 albums? Well, the first album you might pull off the list is, you know, your number one in that small area happens to be Barry Manilow. Hopefully there are no Barry Manilow fans out there. It's Barry Manilow. It might be number 72 or number 1,000 in your total list. But what you've done is you've forced yourself to choose in a very small area. And the number one, there is a number one in that small area, but the number one that you've pulled off is way down the list in terms of the overall risk for the jurisdiction or that area overall. And the same thing goes for predictions, right? You don't want to go so fine that you're forcing predictions into an area that have so little risk that the marginal benefit you get from it is relatively small. You want to work at a scale that's appropriate for the distribution of risk, and we work with each of our forces to find out what that appropriate scale is. And yes, I'm sorry, I should have said Trinidad is a country and not a county. So thank you very much for that question. Any final points here, Cameron?
Well, I would just like to thank you once again for taking time to share your presentation with us today. I'd also like to take a moment to thank all of those who have attended today and taking time out of your day to be with us. At the conclusion of this webinar, you will be asked to complete a very, very brief survey. We will use this information that you give us to plan future webinars, so I thank you in advance for taking a few more moments out of your day. Again, thank you, and I look forward to joining you all again at one of NACOL's future webinars or training events. We do have 2 free regional training and networking events coming up in April, one in Akron, Ohio, and one in St. Petersburg, Florida. Please check the NACOL website for further details on those 2 events, and also please mark your calendars for our annual conference in Riverside, California this year, which will be October 4th through the 8th. Thank you to all, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.